Hello, I am Nikki Going and I'm recording this presentation on behalf of Enhanced Language Services or ELS. This presentation is on Shipwreck by Emily Dickinson, an American poet. I hope that you enjoy it and find it useful. I provide this background information on Emily Dickinson in order for you to understand the context in which she was writing. You will never be specifically examined on background information to a poet, but if you understand something of their life and times, it's much, much easier to understand their poetry. The poet's full name was Emily Elizabeth Dickinson, and she was born on the 10th of December 1830 in Amherst in Massachusetts. Her family was well known and very intellectual. She was well educated for a woman at the time, attending Amherst Academy and later the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. However, she did not stay at the seminary for long, as she chose to return home early. And she gradually became a recluse, withdrawing from interacting with people. She was considered to be quite odd because she did things like dress entirely in white, and she very, very rarely left her home. However, she was an incredibly prolific and talented writer and seemed to write almost compulsively. During her lifetime, she wrote nearly 1,800 poems, very few of which were ever published. They estimate maybe 10 were published while she was alive, and those that were published were heavily edited to fit the very strict format considered acceptable for poetry at the time. And she was quite a rebel. She experimented with language and poetic forms, and her work is famous for expressing a great deal with very few words. It's what we call dense poetry. For her use of slant rhyme, which is also called imperfect rhyme, where words have similar but not identical sounds, and her unusual use of punctuation. She loved using dashes so much that they became known as the Dickinson dash. She's not considered to be a romantic poet, although she dealt with themes that are typical of the romantic poets, like death, immortality, and humanity's powerlessness in the face of natural forces. She also focused on nature as a spiritual and symbolic force and emotional and mental turmoil. After her death in May 1886, her sister Lavinia discovered her unpublished poems and helped to get them published. Today, Emily Dickinson is regarded as one of the most original and important of the American poets. Here is some background to the poem. Although Emily Dickinson lived far inland in Massachusetts, shipwrecks at the time would have made national news. Before the invention of aeroplanes and the development of commercial flights, anyone who wanted to cross the ocean had to do so by ship. In Dickinson's time, most ships were still completely dependent on the wind, and they were sailing ships. There were a few ships that were driven by steam-powered engines, but they weren't commonly available or sailed in. So crossing the oceans in a sailing ship was a really dangerous process. If a storm came up, sailing ships could easily capsize or be blown onto rocks. Navigation was very difficult and was dependent on sailors looking at the stars, the angle of the sun above the horizon, and sometimes quite inaccurate maps in order to calculate their position. Imagine trying to work out where you are on the face of the earth in the middle of a hurricane using a sighting taken from a pitching deck off a star. There were no radios, there was no radar, there were no GPS systems to help them, and if their ship sank, the best that they could hope for was to get into a lifeboat and paddle to a friendly shore, or to be rescued before they starved or died of thirst. The sinking of a ship was as much of a sensational news story then as a plane crash is today. And shipwrecks were common and very widely reported. So although Dickinson doesn't appear to be responding to a particular shipwreck in this poem, she's writing about the responses of the people around her whenever shipwrecks were reported. And as we discuss this, you might be wondering how a poem about the wreck of a sailing ship can possibly be relevant to people in the 21st century. Consider the possibility that the narrative or story of the shipwreck might actually be an extended metaphor, and that Dickinson might be dealing with universal themes in the poem. And I'm just going to give you some information that might get you thinking. Although Dickinson believed in God, she was not very traditional in her religious beliefs. She rejected the idea that people could make definite statements about God and religion, and she tended to see religious faith as an attempt to wrestle with the unknown and to answer questions about the meaning of human existence. So see if you can apply that to the poem Shipwreck. I suggest that you stop the video at this point and consider the questions on this slide. Jot down your thoughts, and then, as we analyze the poem, see if you can relate to the emotions and reactions of the people in the poem as Dickinson goes on to describe them. So the questions are, how do we make sense of terrible things happening to good people? How would you deal with a disaster in which many people die and only a few survive? And finally, is it appropriate or even possible to mourn the dead and celebrate survivors at the same time? As I read the poem, think about what Emily Dickinson might be implying about fate and human fragility. Fate can be understood as the idea that a supernatural power makes decisions about the events in a person's life, and that the outcome of their life is not entirely within their control. We will start with a discussion of the rhyme and rhythm scheme used in the poem. As I read, ask yourself if the rhythm of this poem is regular or irregular, and how the poet creates this effect. Remember that poems are like music. They are written so that they sound a particular way when they are read out loud, and they are made to be heard. Once I've read the poem, I suggest that you stop the video, look at your printed copy of the poem, hopefully you have a printed copy in front of you, and count the number of syllables in each line. Remember that a syllable is the smallest unit of sound that you can break a word down into. For example, glee, the great storm is over, in line 1, consists mostly of single-syllable words, but the last word over has 2 syllables because you can say it as over, and therefore the whole line has 7 syllables. You will notice that if you have a repeated pattern of a predictable number of syllables in the lines of a poem, it creates a very regular, predictable rhythm. Think of twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Every line in that nursery rhyme has exactly 7 syllables. So subconsciously, you know exactly how each line is going to sound. I also suggest that you analyze the rhyme scheme using the ABC method. Once you've listened to the poem, worked out the rhyme scheme for the whole poem, and counted the syllables for each line, have a look at the annotated slide that will soon follow and see if you were correct. So I'm now going to read the poem. The Shipwreck, Emily Dickinson. Glee, the great storm is over. 4 have recovered the land. 40 gone down together into the boiling sand. Ring for the scant salvation, toll for the bonny souls, neighbour and friend and bridegroom spinning upon the shoals. How they will tell the shipwreck when winter shakes the door, till the children ask, but the 40, did they come back no more? Then a silence suffuses the story, and a softness the teller's eye, and the children no further question, and only the waves reply. As I analyze the poem, I suggest that you take notes, highlight key phrases, and also make sure that you understand the technical language terms that I will use. I will remind you what those terms mean when I use them, and I suggest that you write down any definitions that you did not already know. This is because it is very difficult to analyze literature and poetry if you don't have the correct vocabulary. It's also a good idea to work with a copy of the poem in front of you, because then it's much easier to take notes and you can see the whole picture at once. Again, I suggest that you stop the video once I finish talking and see if you've worked out the syllable count and rhyme scheme correctly. On the slide, I've indicated the syllable breaks in the words with more than one syllable by using a red // and the number of syllables in each line with a red number in brackets. If you counted the syllables in each line, you would see that the line lengths are similar but not identical, and that there are some points, for example, line 13 on the next slide, where you have 10 syllables, where the poet has increased the syllable count in order to slow the rhythm down and make the line feel even longer. If you read the poem with a very exaggerated rhythm, as in Glee, the great storm is over, 4 have recovered the land, 40 gone down together into the boiling sand, you will see how regular the rhythm is. And the reason for that is because there's not much variation in the number of syllables in each line. Note that the poem doesn't have a completely regular rhythm, as there are some variations. And if you worked out the rhyme scheme as I suggested earlier, you would have seen that there's a very definite pattern to the rhyme, because the second and fourth line of each stanza rhymes. I've indicated the words that rhyme by using matching brightly colored letters, and black letters are used for lines that don't rhyme with anything else. The rhyme scheme and the arrangement of verses or stanzas works together to split the poem into 4 sets of 4 lines. Each set of 4 lines is known as a quatrain. You'll know from your study of geometry, for example, that quad is Latin for the word 4. And you can see 2 of the quatrains on this slide. Note that you don't have to learn rhyme schemes, for example, off by heart. I'm just trying to demonstrate how you can work out the rhyme scheme and rhythm scheme in a poem so that you can comment on the structure of the poem if you need to, which is a very useful skill, particularly when you're answering questions on the unseen poem. And if you don't know how to work out the rhyme scheme of a poem, here goes with a quick explanation. To begin with, you just look at the last word in each line. The last word in the first line is always marked with an A because you always start at the beginning of the alphabet. So here, over is marked as A. If the last word of any other lines rhyme with over or are a repeat of the word over, then they're also marked with A. But in this case, no other words rhyme with over, so the letter A doesn't ever get reused. Line 2 ends with land. Because land doesn't rhyme with over, it gets the next letter of the alphabet, which is B. Any other words in a line that rhyme with land also get marked with a B, which is why sand in line 4 is given a B. And you just work your way down from the first line, and every time you come across a last word in a line that does not rhyme with another last word, you give it the next letter of the alphabet. So if you were asked to name the rhyme scheme of this ballad, you would just repeat the letters in sequence. For example, the rhyme scheme of the first quatrain is A, B, C, B, and the second quatrain is D, E, F, E. However, being able to say this isn't really the point. You need to be able to link rhyme schemes with the content and the themes of the poem. So say which words rhyme and why it's important that they rhyme. What's it saying in terms of the themes? Otherwise, who cares? You will also notice how a single sentence in each quatrain has been split using enjambment over 4 lines. And that reinforces the rhyme scheme and the focus on a slightly different theme in every quatrain. Remember that poets use rhyme for emphasis to show how ideas are linked and sometimes to create a more definite rhythm. As we discuss the poem, consider how the poet uses rhyme to do those things. And you can hear how the rhythm and the rhyme scheme create musical qualities, which is one of the reasons that this poem is considered a ballad. And a ballad is a poetic form like a lyric or a sonnet or an elegy. This poem is also considered a ballad because it's a narrative poem. In other words, it tells a story about a dramatic event, and it has a musical rhythm that's written in quatrains. However, it does break the rule of a very strict rhythm for a ballad. In a typical ballad, the first line has 8 syllables, the second has 6 syllables, and you repeat that 8 plus 6 and 8 plus 6 rhythm throughout the whole poem, which clearly Dickinson doesn't do. So she breaks that particular rule, but it is a ballad. Note that the last 2 stanzas have the same rhyme scheme as the first 2 stanzas, but that the rhythm in the final stanza changes because each line has more syllables in it. This is particularly obvious in line 13 with 10 syllables. When the last stanza is read, the rhythm gets even slower than the rest of the poem, which greatly increases the sad tone and mood. Line 13 speaks of a silence suffusing the story, and you can hear how that very long line mimics or copies the content, as it seems to build a long pause or silence into the poem at this point. And that literary technique is known as mimesis, where the structure of the writing mimics the content. The Shipwreck, Emily Dickinson. Glee, the great storm is over. 4 have recovered the land. As I read the poem, I asked you to think about what Emily Dickinson might be implying about fate, divine judgment, and human fragility. Quatrain 1, lines 1 and 2 open with glee followed by an exclamation mark. Glee is an older form of English, or archaic English, which means enormous joy or delight. So it's how you might feel if you won the lottery. As the poem was written in the mid-1860s, note that none of the diction or choice of words used by Dickinson would have been considered archaic at the time. So after starting with his exclamation of joy, glee followed by an exclamation mark to emphasize the strength of feeling, we find out why the people described in the poem are so happy. A great storm is over, and 4 have recovered the land, which means that a ship has been wrecked close enough to the shore so that 4 people were saved from drowning. The fact that the storm is over is also followed by an exclamation mark to highlight the speaker's joy. Having saved 4 lives would have also been a reason for great joy, because they would have either had to swim through that pounding surf, those enormous waves, and avoid rocks during a storm, or they would have been saved by people setting off from the shore in little rowing boats. And it was quite common that when people set out to rescue people who had been shipwrecked, that some of the rescuers would drown themselves. It was an incredibly dangerous process trying to rescue people from a sinking ship. You can read these lines as the speaker being grateful that God has spared 4 sailors, which is why I've included the picture with the rainbow on it. But note that the second line ends with a semicolon. That's that punctuation mark that looks like a full stop on top of a comma. Semicolons are used to join 2 sentences that are related to one another, that are of equal importance. So this tells you that more information is to follow. 40 gone down together into the boiling sand. Lines 3 and 4 of the first quatrain follow the semicolon at the end of line 2, and they illustrate the idea that is balanced against the glee that the lives of 4 people have been saved. 40 people have drowned, 10 times as many that were saved. This creates an enormous emotional conflict. Should the saving of 4 lives be celebrated, or should the loss of 40 be mourned? Should there be 10 times more mourning than celebration? Is it possible to do both at once? That metaphor of the boiling sand compares sand churned up from the ocean floor by the violent motion of the waves to ingredients being tossed around in violently boiling water when a person cooks. This is particularly disturbing visual imagery because it implies that the drowning people were tossed around underwater along with the sand by the ocean currents, and it highlights how helpless they were and how violently dangerous the stormy sea was. Ring for the scant salvation, toll for the bonny souls. So the first sound that you heard was the ringing of church bells, rung in joy or celebration. And you could hear there's lots of different sounding bells. It's quite fast. It plays a tune. The second one was the tolling of a bell. It's one single note, usually from one bell, usually the biggest bell that makes the deepest sound. And it's very, very slow. So in these lines of this quatrain, what Dickinson is doing in the second quatrain, lines 5 to 6, is she suggests ways to celebrate the 4 lives that were saved. She starts off by saying that the people in their community should ring the church bells, which is a traditional way to celebrate joyous events like weddings, baptisms, and good news. So that was the first sound you heard. However, the poet is ambivalent about the results of the shipwreck, describing the salvation, which means saving, of their shipwrecked community members as scant, and scant means lacking in generosity, stingy, only a few were saved. Dickinson continues to say that the community should also, in addition to ringing the bells in celebration for those that were saved, they should toll the church bells for the bonny souls of the 40 who drowned. And of course, you would be using the same bells for ringing and tolling, but you're going to create very, very different sounds. Remember that to feel ambivalent means to have opposite and contradictory feelings at the same time. And I'm sure you could hear how a tolling bell, which is usually rung once for every decade of the life of the person who's died, and very slowly, you only ring it for a second, third, fourth time once all the echoes have died away. It sounds very, very different from a ringing bell. Also, you would have noticed that structure of parallel sentences that juxtaposes the verbs ring and toll. And by putting them in the same position, close together in parallel sentences, the contrast flags the fact that both of these sentences are commands and are written in the imperative voice. But they are commands that show opposite feelings, highlighting the conflicting and contradictory emotions that the people of the community that the shipwrecked sailors had come from would have felt. And the word bonny in a Scots dialect is a Scots dialect word meaning attractive or beautiful. Now, Dickinson was writing in America, not Scotland, in Massachusetts. And it was a very unusual choice of diction for her to use that word bonny. But she probably used it to imply that those that drowned came from a very close-knit rural community. Because you would only say that someone was bonny if you felt quite emotional and quite strongly about them. And that, of course, increases the sense of enormous loss. And in case you're wondering what dialect is, it's a distinct form of a language spoken by people in a very specific region or community. So in South Africa, we speak South African dialect, which is why we understand words like tacky and now and and right now and just now. And if you use those words overseas, people look at you like you're mad because they don't understand our dialect. Neighbour and friend and bridegroom spinning upon the shoals. In the second quatrain, lines 7 to 8, you will notice how only the first line of the quatrain focused on those who were saved. That was ring for the scant salvation, while the other 3 lines focus on the 40 bonny souls in line 6 who were drowned. In these lines, 7 to 8, the poet uses a visual image of a terrible kind of dance and how the current in the violently moving ocean spins or whirls the bodies of the drowned around under the water, above a shallow underwater sandbank or shoal. So it looks like they're doing some kind of madly energetic dance. And of course, to spin in a dance means to turn in a circle. And in this image, that celebratory dance that would have happened at a wedding and that would have been attended by all the neighbors and friends in a small community has become a very disturbing parody. Remember, a parody is a mocking copy of an original. Here there is a dance, but it is of corpses of the drowned, and they're not trying to move. They're being carried around by the ocean currents. So in this image, Dickinson highlights the scale of the tragedy and the loss for the small community. The dead all knew each other, and their death has had a terrible impact on their family and their friends. The living have lost neighbors, friends, and at least one bridegroom. So the living includes neighbors, friends, and at least one bride. And as this is a parody or a mocking copy, it's ironic that the dead are still portrayed as being part of a close-knit community that look like they're celebrating life in a communal wedding dance, but they're actually just being washed around by the ocean, and they are a collection of corpses that instead of being united in celebration and joy, are united in death by drowning. How they will tell the shipwreck when winter shakes the door. In lines 9 to 10 of stanza 3, Dickinson comments on how people tend to make meaning out of tragedy and events that they cannot fully explain. They turn them into dramatic stories. Given enough time, the community will describe that terrible shipwreck to their children, And they will talk about how 4 people were miraculously and heroically saved. And it seems that winter is a particularly good time to talk about this kind of thing because they're all warm and safe indoors and they can imagine the storm outside. Notice how Dickinson highlights and emphasizes the threat of the elements and nature by personifying winter as this aggressive character that is rattling the door, almost as though it would like to knock the door down and attack the people inside. Notice also the contrast and contradiction between the threatening world outside the door, which has destroyed, and that's a world that has destroyed people in this community in the past, and the idea of a family cozily inside, listening to stories, which seem to be vastly entertaining. That tone of how they will tell, as the poet exclaims about the enthusiasm and drama with which the story of the shipwreck will be told. And of course, that enthusiasm is the complete opposite of how people actually experienced the event. In these lines, the people listening to the story seem to feel safely insulated from the horror of the way in which the people in the story had died. And perhaps they're only focusing on the heroic and positive aspects of the story, that 4 people survived. They might even feel a little bit smug because they're okay, they didn't die. But obviously that feeling's not going to last, because in lines 11 and 12, there is a complete change in tone. So once again, you have a stanza where the first line seems very positive, but it's going to be followed by 3 lines that introduce a tone of foreboding and foreshadow something negative to come, starting with when winter shakes the door. Remember that foreshadowing means to imply or give clues that something negative is to follow. Till the children ask, but the 40? Did they come back no more? In lines 11 and 12 of stanza 3, Dickinson shows how the people are able to turn a tragedy into a meaningful story, probably highlighting, as I said, the heroic adventure of saving 4 people from drowning. But then, in these lines, they are forced to face the reality that sometimes it's impossible to make meaning from tragedy, that tragedy is brutal precisely because it seems to be so cruel, so unfair, so random, and so illogical. The poet describes how the shipwreck was a satisfying story to tell on a cold winter's night, until the children asked what happened to the 40 who were not rescued. Their question was innocently asked because they have no idea of what not to say or how to avoid uncomfortable truths. And when they ask this question, they remind the storyteller of the real tragedy, that 40 drowned and that they will never come back. In the children's words, they will come back no more. A silence suffuses the story, and a softness the teller's eye. In the 4th quatrain, lines 13 to 14, you will notice how much longer line 13, which is then a silence suffuses the story, how much longer that line is than any other line in the poem. And that's because this line contains 10 syllables compared to the 6 or 8 syllables in most of the other lines. The length of the line and the long vowel sounds in words like silence, suffuses, and story, as well as the alliteration of the S sounds. Technically, that's called sibilance because it's a hissing S sound that's been alliterated. In silence, suffuses, story, and softness, all highlights the long, breathless hush that is the only response that the storyteller is able to give to the children when they ask about the 40 who drowned. You can hear how that very long line mimics or copies the content, as it seems to build a long pause or silence into the poem at this point. And that is the literary technique of mimesis, where the structure of the writing mimics the content. And you also have mimesis with that word suffuses, because suffuses means to soak into or soak through. And that S sound and that silence does suffuse these lines. The softness in the teller's eye implies that the person who is telling the story's eyes either fill with tears or they lose focus, as the person remembers the pain and loss that they suffered when the shipwreck first happened all over again. Notice as well that line 14 ends with a semicolon, which, as you know, indicates that a second equally important sentence is going to be joined onto this one, and that those two sentences will be related. And the children no further question, and only the waves reply. So in lines 15 and 16 of the final fourth quatrain, we find out what the results of the children's questions are. They realize that they've asked about something that the adults do not want to discuss. So the children no further question. In other words, they stop asking questions. And the reason the adults don't answer is either because they can't, or they know that if they do answer, the answer will be too brutal, too harsh, too difficult for the children to understand. So the only response to the children's question about the 40 who were drowned is the sound of the ocean breaking on the shore outside. In other words, only the waves reply. In a sense, that isn't an answer at all, because it's not an answer that humans can understand. Or it's an answer to say that at the end of the day, we are part of nature. We will go back to nature, and our lives don't have any meaning outside of nature. And that's why Dickinson's poem can be considered to be an existentialist poem. She is debating or discussing or wrestling with the nature of existence and whether or not it has meaning. In answer to the question that you were asked to consider before, when we started discussing the poem, how do we make sense of terrible things happening to good people? The answer that Dickinson seems to imply is that we cannot answer that question. We cannot make sense of tragedies and those terrible events. And all they highlight is how vulnerable human beings are in the face of the forces of nature, and how fragile and insignificant our lives are in comparison. And if you're wondering what existentialism is, this is just a reminder. It's a school of philosophy that tries to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? And does life actually have any automatic meaning? And the theories of existentialism are summarized in the name, existentialism. So existentialists come up with a range of answers for the meaning of existence that go from life has no meaning whatsoever, you're born, you live, you die, that's it, which is a school of existentialist thought known as nihilism, from the Latin word nil or nothing. Other existentialists believe that your life doesn't automatically have meaning, but if you work at it, you can lead a meaningful life. And of course, what makes life meaningful will vary from one person to another. And of course, anyone with a strong religious faith will believe that all lives have meaning and that they have been created by a divine being for a specific purpose. So as you've read this poem, I wonder whether you think that Dickinson was a nihilist and was implying that if precious lives can be so easily and arbitrarily destroyed, maybe life actually has no real meaning. Or was she still writing from a religious perspective, and she's trying to imply that our ability to understand God and the workings of God through nature are very limited, and we can't answer those questions, not because there are no answers, but because we're incapable of actually coming up with good answers. Question for discussion. Emily Dickinson's poem, The Shipwreck, is not merely a narrative poem about a shipwreck. Instead, it deals with universal themes. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Justify your response with specific references to the structure, tone, and imagery used in the poem. So before you start answering a poetry essay question, you have to make sure that you understand the technical language used. A narrative poem is one that tells a story. A universal theme is a central idea or message that most people can relate to because it deals with experiences that are common to everyone. To justify means to give evidence for your ideas and take the evidence from the poem. Remember that structure is the way that a text has been built, and it would include a discussion on aspects like rhyme, rhythm, and the form or type of the poem. Tone is the emotions that an author or speaker conveys with their words. It's related to mood, but it's not identical. Mood is the way that a reader or an audience is made to feel, and unlike with tone, you don't need a speaker to create mood. Imagery refers to figures of speech like sensory imagery, metaphors, similes, and personification. I'm only going to give you some suggestions of things that you could comment on if you were asked to write this poetry essay in the exams. And bear in mind that a poetry essay is only about 200 words, and what I'm giving you is probably longer than that, but it's just to give you some good ideas. I'm also going to talk you through the process of structuring a poetry essay as I discuss a possible answer. So in terms of the process, an introduction to a literature essay, and a poetry essay is a literature essay, should always include your hypothesis, which is the big idea you're setting out to prove. So start your hypothesis with the name of the text and the author, and then rephrase the question as a statement. In this way, you will hopefully stick to the question throughout your essay, because that statement is what you're going to try and prove throughout your essay. You must also include a sentence where you explain how you will structure your essay. I sometimes call it the roadmap or overview sentence. And if necessary, define any words or terms that can be interpreted in more than one way. Notice that your introduction is very short. It's going to be 2 or 3 sentences at the most. So this is my introduction. Listen out for the hypothesis, the roadmap statement, and any definitions. The Shipwreck by Emily Dickinson can be read as both a narrative poem that tells a story and as an extended metaphor and existentialist poem that deals with the theme of the meanings of human life and whether or not meaning can be found in tragedy. A universal theme is a timeless idea that most people can relate to, regardless of when a poem was written. These universal themes can be seen in the structure, tone, and imagery that Dickinson uses in her poem. So that's the end of my introduction. Notice that in my overview statement, I said that I would discuss structure, tone, and imagery. Therefore, the body of my essay should consist of 3 paragraphs, 1 on structure, 1 on tone, and 1 on imagery. And as I listed those in that order in my introduction, I need to write them in the same order in the body of my essay. In each body paragraph, I need to specifically link back to that universal theme of the human search for meaning. And each paragraph should contain at least 1 argument. Remember that an argument always consists of a point you want to prove, evidence from the poem that proves that point, and that can either be a paraphrase where you just restate something in your own words, or a quote, and an explanation of how the evidence proves your point. So to remember the structure of an argument, remember the acronym PEE, P for point, E for evidence, and E for explanation. And you can also add an L for a linking sentence to the next paragraph. So as I discuss my proposed body paragraphs, listen out for that peel structure. And this would be my suggested body for this essay topic. The Shipwreck is a ballad. Ballads are traditional poetic form in which a narrative is used to discuss a broader theme. In this poem, Dickinson describes a shipwreck and the reactions of the survivors in a close-knit community. In doing so, she raises questions about the universal theme of humanity's search for meaning, particularly in response to tragedy. The poem has a very definite rhyme scheme that is typical of a ballad, where the 2nd and 4th lines of each of the 4 stanzas rhyme. This contributes to the fairly regular rhythm, which is emphasized by the fact that most lines consist of approximately 8 syllables. The use of parallel lines highlights this rigid structure and allows Dickinson to juxtapose contrasting ideas and illustrate the conflict and ambivalence within the community. For example, in lines 5 and 6, ring for the scan salvation, is followed immediately by the very similar line in Toll for the Bonnie Souls, which highlights the conflict between simultaneously celebrating or ringing bells to mark the saving of 4 lives and tolling bells to mourn 40 deaths. In the second, third, and fourth stanzas, the poet uses the first line of the stanza to describe a response to the tragedy that seems to imply that it's possible to see a meaning in it. For example, ring for the scant salvation implies celebration in stanza 2, and how they will tell the shipwreck in stanza 3. However, the stanzas then continue with 3 lines in which the event seems cruel in the way that people are unable to come to terms with it. For example, in stanza 2, a wedding dance becomes a bizarre parody of corpses that only look like they're dancing in the ocean current. And in stanza 3, the storyteller cannot continue. And of course, the final stanza ends with no voice but that of the waves. The rhythm scheme of the poem is actually less strict than that of a traditional ballad, particularly in the lines where Dickinson describes a failure to find meaning in tragedy. For example, in lines 11 to 13, the poet describes an enthusiastic retelling of the story of the shipwreck, which is completely halted when a listening child innocently asks, "But the 40, did they come back no more?" The storyteller is completely unable to respond. And line 13 explains, "Then a silence suffuses the story." This line contains 10 syllables, and the use of the long vowel sounds and the sibilants in the alliteration of the S sounds in silence suffuses and story all make the reading of the line even slower, and they mimic the pained silence that follows the child's question. Therefore, the structure of the poem is both linked to telling an exciting story of a shipwreck and to discussing the universal theme of people's inability to make sense or meaning of tragedy. The second body paragraph would deal with tone, and you could phrase it something like this. The poet's tone also changes to highlight the difficulties of making meaning of tragedy. Note that that's my link sentence between the 2 paragraphs. For example, the tone of lines 1 and 2 is joyous and celebratory. Glee, the great storm is over. 4 have recovered the land. And it's in complete contrast to lines 3 and 4. 40 gone down together into the boiling sand. The abrupt and dramatic shift in tone from celebratory to sad or ominous illustrates that the speaker is unable to simultaneously celebrate the living and mourn the dead. And that shift in tone occurs throughout the poem. For example, in the 3rd stanza, the tone when describing the storyteller describing the shipwreck is one of great enthusiasm. How they will tell the story, highlighting that the storyteller will dramatize the story and will probably emphasize the drama and heroism in the rescue of the 4 people from that rough ocean and from the sinking ship. However, the tone with which the response to the children's question is described is very sad, as the speaker describes the storyteller being lost for words. Then a silence suffuses the story, and probably weeping as they're described in terms of a softness being in their eye. The contrast between how they will tell and silence is marked and emphasized. Then my 3rd paragraph would need to deal with imagery. Here goes. The shipwreck can be considered to be a symbol of any natural disaster that causes conflicting emotions or ambivalence in the survivors. Throughout the poem, nature is personified as a malevolent force that acts in ways that are impossible to explain. For example, in stanza 3, winter personified is described as violently shaking the door, implying that winter would like to attack and destroy those within. The drowning of the sailors from the wrecked ship is also described in terms of imagery that highlights the violence of their end and their helplessness in the stormy sea. They are described in stanza 1 as going down or drowning together into the boiling sand, and once drowned as neighbor and friend and bridegroom spinning upon the shoals. In the first image, they're described like ingredients in a violently bubbling pot, which highlights their complete helplessness in the violently agitated sea and how they lose all their humanity in the face of the forces of nature. In the second image, where they are described as spinning upon the shoals, we have a parody of a wedding dance, and it's a deeply disturbing image of 40 corpses being whirled around in an undersea current so that they look like they're dancing. The fact that the community that has drowned includes neighbor and friend and bridegroom increases the reader's sense of the terrible scale of the tragedy and the devastation that it has caused for the community of survivors. The final line, which is the answer to the question, but the 40, did they come back no more, shows that the speaker is speechless with grief and not knowing what to respond, so the storyteller just remains silent, and only the waves reply. Nature literally has the last word in this poem, and it doesn't communicate particularly clearly. If the waves say anything at all that humans can understand, they imply that the dead are forever lost at sea, and that there is no answer to questions about the meaning of their death. Read in terms of the universal themes, and not purely in terms of the aftermath of a shipwreck, it is obvious that the poem addresses the question of the meaning of human life, suffering, tragedy, and death, and it offers no definite answer. Remember that your conclusion is a very short summary of why your hypothesis is correct. My conclusion would be something like the following. Based on the poet's non-traditional use of the rhythm of the ballad format, her tone that shifts constantly and dramatically, and her imagery that implies that the shipwreck can be read as a symbol for any human tragedy, it is obvious that although the poem functions very effectively as a narrative about a shipwreck, it also deals with far greater universal themes. The poet wrestles with the question of finding meaning in tragedy and finally concludes that doing so is beyond human capacity. When it comes to the question of the value of human life in the face of tragedy, nature reminds humanity that they are finite, vulnerable, and insignificant in terms of the universal picture, which is why only the waves reply. And just a couple of quick notes. You do not have to say that a statement given in an essay like this is totally true or totally false. You can take a yes and no approach. You can somewhat agree. Here I completely agreed. You also don't have to agree with my views. You could have a completely different opinion and also get 100% for a right answer. Because remember that in literature, the only correct answers are those that you can prove with evidence from the text. And note that you can use the structure that I've discussed in order to write any literature or discursive essay, for example, any history essay. And I will create a specific video on discursive essay writing, but hopefully this just gives you a quick and helpful formula that you can use. Please note that this vocabulary on these slides is listed in the order in which it was used. Check that you understand each word, make sure that you can spell it correctly, and enjoy using it when you're talking about this poem. I'm just going to read the words to you so that you know how they are pronounced. So some general vocabulary, you can talk about fate, you can talk about existentialist, existentialism, or nihilism. If you are talking about vocabulary for structure, you can talk about syllables and syllable breaks, rhyme and rhythm scheme, quatrain, verse and stanza, ballad, narrative poem, enjambment, parallel sentences, contrast and juxtaposition, diction, including dialect and archaic language, and the moods of the verb. Remember, those are imperative if an order is being given, indicative if a statement is being made, interrogative if a question is being asked, and subjunctive if a possibility is being suggested. And most of the sentences in this poem are indicative, and there are a few imperative sentences that start with verbs and give a command. Other useful vocabulary refers to figures of speech, and these are the ones that were used in the poem. Please be very careful when you get asked questions about figures of speech that you do not give answers about parts of speech because they will be completely and utterly wrong. Parts of speech are nouns, adjectives, verbs, etc., and they don't usually come up in literature assessments. So the figures of speech I discussed were ambivalence, juxtaposition, parody, mimesis, sensory imagery, foreshadowing, mood and tone, irony, metaphors, similes and extended metaphors, and personification, connotations, and implication. Phonic devices are language techniques that affect the way a poem sounds when it is read out loud. Please notice that in an exam or an assessment, you will specifically be asked to identify or comment on phonic devices or sound devices. Don't give a phonic device in response to a question about a figure of speech. So remember, rhyme is spelt rhyme has you and me. Rhythm is spelt rhythm has your two hips moving. Alliteration and sibilance are also important phonic devices. And then there is assonance and onomatopoeia. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I've created this channel so that any learner or teacher who's working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to teaching and detailed learning materials. If you would like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe my channel and pass the link on to any and all of your friends who would find it useful. You're also very welcome to make a small donation to support this work, although I certainly don't expect you to do so. If you would like to make a donation, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. And thank you for your time. I will see you on another presentation.